I want you to imagine a ball of earbuds just wrapped up in this huge knot that you can't really seem to unravel. Because of this, you've been working at this knot for the last 20 minutes and you're late to either your school or your work. So eventually, you just decide to give up on this endeavor of trying to untie your earbuds and go wherever you need to go to for the day. Even though that decision might have saved you some time in the morning, you're going to have to take into account the times where you couldn't work or you couldn't relax because your earbuds weren't there to give you that level of privacy. And yeah, sure, earbuds aren't the biggest deal in the world, but what if this was something where because you lost this thing, you aren't able to perform specific functions in your day to day life that mean a lot to you or could potentially make your life a lot easier? This is the exact problem that we're facing with space exploration these days. I mean, just picture an astronaut coming onto this desolate planet with materials they almost have no knowledge of. And because of this, they aren't able to make the best use of that planet. And so they're relying on materials coming in from the Earth to facilitate their needs. And yes, there are missions like Perseverance that are helping us explore these planetary surfaces and develop an idea of what materials are on there before we land. But at the same time, beyond Mars, there are asteroids in the asteroid belt, moons on Jupiter. There's solar systems that we don't even know about yet with planets of their own. And if we're just trying to find the materials for every single one of these planets before we land on them, that's basically the equivalent of trying to unravel like 100 earbuds in like the span of 5 hours. So we need a quicker solution that is able to analyze these compositions right on the fly when we ask it to. In this video, I'm going to be talking about capillary electrophoresis and how this method is implementable in fields such as astrobiology and planetary science, how it works, and how we can execute it accordingly. Alrighty, so before we get into the explanation for capillary electrophoresis, I just want to say that this video isn't really meant to give a very technical of an explanation as to what's going on. It's mostly just to share some of the basics and hopefully give you enough insight that maybe you could go do further research on your own or be inspired to do further research on your own. Or also, personal leverage here, you can check out my Medium article, which will be linked down below in the description. That will give like a full technical explanation of all the formulas, systems that you need to know, and even applications that you might need to know to like fully understand this subject and maybe pursue a project of your own later on. This is the protein hemoglycin. It was the first ever protein discovered in space, and it was discovered on an asteroid. And the reason I wanted to build this and show it to you is not really to talk about the molecular structure, but more to go into the complexity, because I just wanted to visually show you that even though there are visible patterns that we can see and like there's a multitude of elements that are constantly being repeated, there is still that complex molecular structure that we need to break down. And it's really hard to break a structure like this down just by looking at it for the first time. I mean, you can imagine an astrobiologist or an astronaut just coming down to a new planet and having to look at a protein like this and wanting to figure out how it functions, especially if you don't have any astrobiological experience or experience with planetary science at all. It is just very difficult. It's almost like going back to our earbud example. You're trying to make something out of tangled earbuds, which isn't really possible. But if we were to untangle the earbuds and straighten this out and make it more easier to look at and use, we'd be able to get a lot more functions out of it. Capillary electrophoresis is a separation technique where you can input multiple different substances from proteins to even nanoparticles. And what the capillary electrophoresis system does is it's able to separate the multiple components of these substances. So for example, for proteins, it would be amino acids. And from there, it's able to analyze the concentration levels of each substance along with several other different variables that you can analyze afterwards. So for the capillary electrophoresis simulator, we're going to be using PeakMaster, which is a simulator developed by Bohuslav Gass. He's a professor of physical chemistry and faculty of science at Charles University. And for PeakMaster, what you can do is you can go to Gass's professional website, which you can do through a simple Google search, And from there, he has a tab on PeakMaster where you can access two versions of downloads. You can access the 5.3 version or the 5.4. Personally, for me, even though this is the newest version, 5.3 tends to work best on my computer. So that is the one that I chose. But then again, it really just depends on what type of computer you have. So today I'm just going to be giving a quick description of what this like capillary electrophoresis simulator is and what it looks like and how you can use it to analyze the concentrations of different substances. So this is just to give an idea of how the system would work in general. If you do want a more technical or in-depth explanation, you can definitely check out my article, which will be linked in the description below. So we're first going to be going into setting up our parameters. So the first thing I did was just set up the total length of the capillary tube, which was 80 centimeters. But then I also had to make sure that the capillary length to the detector was very close to what the capillary length for the tube is. And the capillary tube is just like the tube where the substances are going through while they're being separated. And the reason these two have to be very close to the same ratio is just because if, for example, if this tube is too long and the detector can't detect every single substance in there, you're obviously not going to get the most effective results. Same thing, if the detector is too big but the capillary tube is too small, then you're just going to get overly magnified results, which doesn't really benefit you too much. So it's very important to have them both nearing the same length. For polarity, capillary electrophoresis, CE, the abbreviation for that, CE systems, they typically follow conventional current, meaning that they flow from positive to negative. So in this case, the injection site would just be where you're injecting your analyte or your substance. So in this case, you would just be injecting it into the anode because it's going from positive to negative, which is why I set this to positive. Driving voltage is just the voltage that everything's running at, but the voltage is usually fairly high. And this is just the electroosmotic flow, EOF. For this, I set it to marker time, meaning that we're measuring the migration time. The other options are just no EOF altogether or just mobility, meaning that the system, the simulator will automatically set a time for you. I just wanted to set the time myself just because personally I found this time that they were setting was way too fast. So I just set mine to 20 minutes. The next thing is just system parameters. In this case, initially before I ran this or before I calculated it, this was all blank because the system just automatically runs this for you. You don't really need to do anything. These are just parameters measuring how the buffer fluid looks in case, for example, if this results didn't come out the way you wanted to, you can look and see if that's because of the buffer fluid, which is what we'll be going into right now. So the buffer fluid can also be referred to as BGE. And what this is, for example, if you're injecting a substance into a tube, it's not really going to flow on its own. It kind of needs another thing to keep it moving or another thing to carry it along. So they speak because the reason that the molecules are able to separate in the first place when it goes through the tube is because each component of a molecule has a different charge. And for that reason, it's going to end up in a different place in the tube. But the problem with that is things that are primarily negatively charged and aren't attracted to the cathode, like on the other side, will likely end up at the very edge of the tube. But we don't want that because it's not going to be detected, which is why we have the buffer fluid to keep it moving and keep it moving to the other side of the tube just as effectively. So we can still see that it's at the far end, but it's not too far away that we can't see it at all. One thing we do want to make sure for the buffer fluid, though, is that it is neutral because if it's too positive or too negative, it will interfere with the results that we get for our analytes, which are just our substances. So in this case, I used two different types of fluid just so when we combine them, they can become neutral. For the positive aspect of my fluid, I used sodium, and for the negative aspect, I used phosphoric acid. Results of these, once again, are just measured the moment you calculate it. Moving on to the analytes, when I calculated this, what I ended up getting is a calculation for all the different concentrations. So one thing I do want to take into account is just the separation time or the signal. One huge correlation that we need to keep in mind is it isn't just charge that separates these molecules, it's also the size, which can also be a huge variable that we might need to play around with every now and then. Because, for example, The separation time of this molecule over here, it's a lot bigger than the rest of them just because it's insane amounts of concentration compared to all of the other like analytes. And for that reason, it just has a higher separation time compared to the others who have less of a signal. There are two main types of fluids in a capillary electrophoresis system. The first is sample fluid, followed by buffer fluid. So sample fluid is the analytes or just the substances that we want to analyze during our experiment. And then the buffer fluid is just the fluid that helps guide the sample fluid to where it needs to go. Buffer fluid primarily is neutral charge. So that just means it can't be positive or negatively charged just because it'll interfere with the sample. In that case, for example, a positively charged buffer fluid might cause the sample to go faster or might just interfere with the results itself. For example, the oxygen might go in a different spot compared to where it would have been otherwise. For zeta potential to work, we need to focus primarily on the capillary wall. If you do want a greater explanation of how zeta potential works, or some equations or formulas revolving around that, whether that be electroosmotic flow or electrophoretic mobility, I highly recommend that you check out my article where I do go more in depth into these things. But for now, I will say that like the outside of the capillary wall, or like the internal area of the capillary wall, is primarily positively charged. And for that reason, since it is a conventional current, and it does go to the negative source of power, the positively charged ions on the capillary wall flow in that direction, and then that's what moves the buffer fluid as well. All right, so that's it for now. If you like this video, please don't forget to hit the like button down below. Also, otherwise, I really do hope that you enjoyed this video and maybe learned something new from it. Maybe it even inspired you to build a project of your own, or just inspire you to go down the field of astrobiology or planetary science and see what you find. It's really such an interesting field to explore, and I feel like it's very underestimated in the space tech community. So yeah, I hope that you like this video. That's it, and I'll see you soon.